Good morning, everybody, or whatever time of day it is, whenever you're listening to this. Let's do a very quick review of what we did last week, and then we're going to go on and finish the topic we call Nidre, since can't schlep it out too long, since Yom Kippur is fast approaching and will be done presumably before the next meeting of the Efrat Kolo. What we saw last time was, after examining several passages in the Torah which talk about the significance of Nidrim, of vows, not only in the Torah itself, but also in the book of Kohelet, that perhaps we could summarize the attitude towards vows the following way: that every Jew is expected to be a person of his word. Like, my word is my bond, right? That we take very, very seriously the commitments that we make. And as a matter of fact, because of that, it's best not to make these formalized promises. And the Shulchan Aruch summarizes this, that in fact, the person shouldn't become accustomed to making these vows. And the Talmud, which quoted by the Shulchan Aruch, goes so far as to say that even if a person fulfills his vows, he's called an evil person. And we pointed out that it's because that even though he got lucky and he was able to fulfill his vow, that there's something pretentious about making such a formalized commitment about something that will happen in the future. You know, if I say I'm going to donate $1 million to Torah institutions, that presumes that in 6 months you're going to have $1 million in the bank in order to give to Torah institutions. And who knows what's going to be? Maybe there's going to be a pandemic, which may in fact undermine your financial standing. So there's something pretentious about making that vow, something even somewhat arrogant about it. And so therefore, it's best not to vow. There is a limited positive function of vows, especially in terms of trying to beat bad habits. So it's so hard to change habits. And we see in the Shulchan Aruch even cites this, that and also in Pirkei Avot, based on Pirkei Avot, that if a person wants to curb a bad habit, a bad character trait, that if worse comes to worse, if they think that by making such a formalized commitment of a vow, they're allowed to do that, right? So I'm no longer going to, all Haagen-Dazs ice cream is forbidden to me for the next year since I want to lose weight, right? So that'd be an example. That's not a vow, by the way, but that'd be an example of a constructive use of a vow. We then saw that there are two ways of getting rid of vows. One of them is called in Hebrew hafarat nidarim, and that's very specific to the context of a family. Within the context of the family, that the husband can nullify the vows of his wife, or father can nullify the vows of his daughter. And we said we're not going to discuss this philosophically. That's one of the ways of dealing with it. The other way of dealing with vows is through hatarat nidarim. It's a slightly different word. And hatarat nidarim is a mechanism which is not discussed in the Torah. We saw the fact that Talmud says that this is a category of law in which there seems to be no basis whatsoever in Tanakh for it, though other opinions in the Talmud then say, well, maybe there's some very cryptic allusions to it, perhaps. But in any case, this mechanism is to go before a tribunal of 3 judges or one single expert in vows, and the person goes before the tribunal and says, boy, I really made a big mistake. I made this commitment, and if I would have known then what I would have known now, I would have never made this particular commitment. And the court says, you really regret that you made that vow? And the guy says, yeah, for sure, I really regret it. And they say, you're forgiven, you're forgiven, you're forgiven. The vow is undone, and magically the vow disappears. I should point out, just as an aside, that the Rambam had defined, what are we talking about when we say vows? So the Rambam said there are 2 major categories. One of them is if you forbid upon yourself something that otherwise would be permitted, like a person says, I'm not going to eat Haagen-Dazs ice cream, or more precisely, the Haagen-Dazs ice cream is forbidden to me, right? I'm going to treat it like a cheeseburger. Or if one commits to making a donation. So for instance, if I have a nice little animal and I'm going to commit that animal to be an offering to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, so that would be another type of vow. So those are the 2 major categories of vow which the Rambam mentions. Okay, now the
Question?
yes.
Isn't the idea of a vow to lock you in exactly when you really wouldn't want to do it? And that's the idea of the vow? I mean, because we're
חסר
using an
לבעיות.
excuse to get out of the vow by saying, well, we didn't really, if we would have known this, we would never do it. But that's the idea of taking the vow.
Yeah. So first of all, I think someone has their microphone on, and so
No.
if you have your microphone on, you should mute yourself. But in any case, it's a good question. So I think the answer is that a vow is to encourage you to be able to, in fact, follow through with a commitment. However, it's the type of challenge to the commitment that you see in advance. Like that's what the way Shulchan Aruch describes it. If a person sees, I'm going to commit myself to learning all of Shas in the following year in memory of my dearly departed father. Okay, I know that's going to be challenging, right? So I can make a vow in advance because I know it's going to be hard. So there's full awareness of the difficulties. That's precisely why I made the vow.
Right.
But that's not what happens when you do Hatarat Nidarim, as nullification of vows. There you say, I had no idea when I made that vow that this thing would happen. I didn't, so that's very different, right? So that's very important for the nullification of vows, Hatarat Nidarim, because it's called Charata Meikara. You're like retroactively uprooting the vow because you're saying it was made under false pretenses, maybe you could say it. In some ways, it's analogous to when you purchase something. If the original purchase was made under false pretenses, there was something that was hidden from me, some information, then that's called a mekach ta'ut in Jewish law, that the whole sale was under mistaken pretenses, and therefore it's retroactively null and void. Okay, now, we now jump to the 9th century, because we haven't even mentioned Kol Nidre yet. We get to 9th century, and the first printed Sidur, Arthur's smiling, because he's done some research on this topic, and this is the Sidur of Rav Amram Gaon. He was the Rosh Yeshiva of Sura, the town in modern-day Iraq, we call Babylonia. He has the oldest Sidur that we possess. Doesn't mean there weren't Sidurim before that, but in terms of what's in our hands, you can get the whole thing. And he quotes Kol Nidre. But surprisingly, after he quotes Kol Nidre, interestingly enough, by the way, it's the same, more or less the same Kol Nidre we have now, but in Hebrew. It's kind of counterintuitive. One probably have thought that the original Kol Nidre would have been in Aramaic, right, which was the lingua franca in those circles. And now we would have changed it to Hebrew, since our Aramaic is not that good, but it's actually the opposite. That for some interesting reason, which I'm not 100% sure of, that his Kol Nidre was in Hebrew. And maybe I should just point out, I can't remember exactly if last week we actually quoted his Kol Nidre. So maybe we should do that right now. So we're on page 3, according to the way my handout printed. There are those who do the following. So you notice, by the way, he's not advocating it. He's just saying there are those who do the following. That when the Shliach Tzibor stands up right before Yom Kippur, and he says the following: Kol nidarim ve'isurim u'shvot ve'kiyumin ve'charamin. So all these types of vows, all these different terminologies to refer to different types of vows. Don't ask me the difference between these categories of vows. Shenadarnu v'she'asarnu v'shenishbanu v'shekiyamnu al nafshenu b'shvuah. All these vows that we vowed, in different words for the verb to vow, upon ourselves with a vow. No, here's very important. Miyom haKippurim shavar ad Yom Kippur hazeh haba aleinu. From last Yom Kippur until this coming Yom Kippur, which will come for the good, which could be just a few minutes because it's right before Yom Kippur. Bechulam chazarnu. We want to retract it all. Uvanu lifnei avinu shebashamayim. We've come before our Father in heaven. Im neder nadarnu. If we have made a neder, ein kan neder, no neder. Im shvua nishbanu. If we made an oath, no oath. Ein kan shvua. There's no oath anymore. In kiyum kiyamnu, with this other type of commitment. In kan kiyum, it's no longer around. Batel and neder mikaro, that the neder, this vow, is uprooted, no good, null and void. Bitilah hashvua meikara, the oath is undone. Batel kiyumi karo uses the three different terms for vows. It's also undone. And kalona velo isur velo cherem. There's no debtor, there's no isur, there's no cherem. These are different types of vows. Velo shua and that type of vow. Velo kiyum and there's no kiyum. There's also another category of vows. Yesh kan mechila uslicha, but rather there is forgiveness and another word for forgiveness, the kapara and atonement. As it says in Scripture, that all the congregation of Israel is forgiven, and even the stranger in your midst. For to the entire nation, it was a shkaga, an error. So this is referring to passages in the Torah which talk about forgiveness for things done erroneously, shkaga. In this case, referring to the vows. That's the text. Now, Rav Amram Gaon, after he quotes the text, he says some people do this. He then says, but from the holy yeshiva, they sent the following message. Shemin ha-shtut huzeh. This is a stupid custom. Shtuyot, nonsense. It's a nonsensical custom. Vasur lasochein. It's forbidden to do it. Forbidden. Whoa, whoa, whoa. We went from Kol Nidre, the favorite part of Yom Kippur, when all hearts melt, as Al Jolson sings, Kol Nidre. You know what I'm talking about? The first talking movies, has Al Jolson.
And then Neil Diamond.
Oh, that's the modern version, right?
Yeah.
So the old version, right? Like Al Jolson is, right? He sings Kol Nidre as his father, the Chazan, is on his deathbed.
Is this a new email that, because I didn't get this, the forward. Is this from last week's email or
Last week?
a new email?
No, new.
Okay,
Old,
fine.
old. Yeah, you could conjure it up there in your, yeah. So,
What page are you on?
Yeah, page 4. Page 4. So this is rather shocking. Something which is so beloved by the Jewish people all around the world. Our first attesting to its presence, 9th century, Rav Amram Gaon. That's not your local Orthodox rabbi, by the way. When you're the Rosh Yeshiva of Sura or Pimpodita, you're called Gaon, right? Which exalted one. That was like being the chief rabbi of the world. Very significant. And he says it's minhag shtut, ridiculous, and forbidden to do it. You know, it's one thing to say not recommended. Vasur lasochein, forbidden. So the question is, you're kidding. What's so terrible about it? So he actually doesn't explain. He just says it's minhag shtut and it's forbidden to do it. So
what exactly is forbidden?
To say Kol Nidre. Forbidden. So you better get ready. Just tear out that page of your Machzor. Okay? Forbidden. So, as you may know, the great Rashi had no sons, only daughters. His daughters married great Torah scholars, and they had children who became great Torah scholars, and one of those children is known as Rabbeinu Tam, very famous scholar who lived in France, right, after Rashi. So Rashi's his Zeta, his grandfather. And in the anthology of commentary in the Talmud called Tosafot, Rabbeinu Tam is quoted, and Rabbeinu Tam explains why this Kol Nidre is nonsense and forbidden to be said. So let's take a look at this passage in Tosafot where Rabbeinu Tam is quoted. Mitoch shmati mochit Rabbeinu Tam asher katuv machzorim b'chol nidre miyom kippurim she'avar yom kippur haba aleinu l'tova. So the Tosafot starts out by saying Rabbeinu Tam erased one sentence from Kol Nidre. The sentence which says the vows from last Yom Kippur until this Yom Kippur. Rabbeinu Tam deleted that sentence. Usfurim heim, and Rabbeinu Tam explains that the people whose custom is to recite Kol Nidre, which apparently was a widespread custom in Iraq by the time of the 9th century, they think shematrim nidarim, that they're getting rid of vows mishana shevra from the last year of Atoin. They are mistaken. Toim, like the word minhag, right? It's a ridiculous custom because it's all based upon a ta'ut. It's a mistake. Now, I just want to point out at this point, even before we explain why it's a minhag shtut according to Rabbeinu Tam, and why he deleted that sentence, I want to explain why Rav Amram Gon said it's vasula solchein, it's forbidden to do it. So you could say like, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's not like you're making a blessing that wasn't needed, a bracha lavatala, which is actually there's some kind of like technical sin involved when you use God's name. It's just like a bunch of legalese. Why forbidden? It's very clear the reason why. Because he just said it. They think that they're matirim nidarim. They're undoing vows. Now, let's just remind ourselves, there are two ways of girding vows. Hafarat nidarim and hatarat nidarim. Hatarat nidarim is in the context of the family. Obviously, that's not what's going on in Kol Nidre. And hatarat nidarim is the other mechanism. So they think they're doing hatarat nidarim, the absolution of vows. But they're wrong. Now, think about this for a second. If you made a vow this past year, and you go to Kol Nidre, and you're feeling really good afterwards because you just wiped out from your conscience the fact that you had made a commitment this past year. And you don't have to abide by that commitment anymore because it's been nullified. So if it doesn't work, that means the vow that you made is still in force. So you committed to never eating Haagen-Dazs ice cream again. It's forbidden to you, right? Kol Nidre, delete button on that commitment. So now you're home free. You can go home, and in order to break the fast from Yom Kippur, you're going to eat a gallon of Haagen-Dazs ice cream. What pleasure. Can't think of anything, can't think of much nicer than that. Okay? So the only problem is that if Kol Nidre doesn't work, he just committed a super bad transgression. Because in Kohelet, remember what it said there in Ecclesiastes? Right? That unfulfilled vows, it's that, God's going to destroy the work of your hands because of unfulfilled vows. Like, this is serious and scary repercussions. So that's why it's forbidden. Because people end up eating a gallon of Haagen-Dazs ice cream right after Yom Kippur. That's a bad way to start the new year.
Wouldn't this be an avera from the shul to put this stumbling block in front of all these people if they don't put a precursor to say this is not in fact canceling anyone's vows?
You're that's a very good point. It's not only could lead to a terrible sin on the part of the person, the lay person who thinks their vows are nullified, but it's extraordinarily not just irresponsible, but a sin, because we have this prohibition of putting something before the blind when you create conditions which are liable to cause somebody else to transgress. Good point. So now let's go back to Rabbeinu Tam, and he's going to tell you why this Kol Nidre is absurd and it doesn't work. So he says the following: Chada. I hope you can see the text there. Chada. Number one reason it doesn't work. Bechol hatarat nidarim ba'icharata mi'ikara. Whenever you do hatarat nidarim, which is the other way of getting rid of vows other than doing it within the context of the family, which is hafarat nidarim, you need to have regret from the outset. You have to say, if I would have known what I was getting myself into, I would have never have done this. I have like retroactive regret, like buyer's remorse, or is there such an expression? whatever. Okay, so look at the text of Kol Nidre. Is anybody saying, whoa, if I would have known what I was getting myself into when I said that Haagen-Dazs ice cream was forbidden to me, I would have never have made that commitment. It's not in there. It's not in the text. That's number one. Doesn't have that requirement. Number two, you need to have a Beit Din. So you need to have 3 dayanim, 3 judges. Or if you have the world's greatest expert in Nidarim, that works the same way as a Beit Din. Don't got that. We're not doing it in front of a Beit Din or the world's greatest expert in Nidarim. So that's number 2. 2 strikes. And furthermore, he says that even though there's a debate in the Talmud about it, but he says we paskin according to the opinion that says that you have to explicitly describe what the neder was. You have to say that I forbid unto myself Haagen-Dazs. Look at the text of Kol Nidre. There's not one mention of Haagen-Dazs. You ever notice that? I bet it was surprising to you that there's not one mention of Haagen-Dazs. Right? We don't do it. There is no specific mention of any particular vow. Furthermore, there's something also very strange. The chazan. So, who's the Beit Din? Cantor Shapiro. So he's also getting his vows nullified, right? Well, except for if he's the one who's nullifying his vows? The vower can't nullify his own vows. So it's another reason why this whole thing is mysterious and no reason it should work. So that's called 3 strikes, you're out, right? In baseball, that's the way it works, and it works that way in halacha too. So there's at least 3 problems, 3 ways in which Kol Nidre does not comport with the requirements of Hatarat Nidarim, nullifying of vows, and therefore it doesn't work, and therefore it's forbidden to do, because it's just nonsense. And everybody's walking away thinking that right after the fast is over, they're going to have a gallon of Haagen-Dazs ice cream, and boy.
Is this Haagen-Dazs? Is this like Das Torah?
Yes, exactly right. Haagen-Dazs. 100%. Okay, so Rabbeinu Tam now goes on, he says, but you know what? And what's interesting about what he's about to do is it's typical of the generation of the Tosafot. They tend to want to, even if they have to bend over backwards, affirm the validity of widespread custom. So Rav Amram Gon seemed to have no compunction about just saying, there's some people who do this, it's garbage, throw it out. You shouldn't do it. Rabbeinu Tam explains why it makes no sense. But being a member of the club of the Baalei Tosafot, he wants to somehow find some legitimacy to it. So he says he can do it, but he's going to have to engage in some textual emendation. Lekach nirelo, that's why Rabbeinu Tam did the following. Lahagia miyom kippurim zad yokim rabba aleinu l'tova. That instead of referring to vows from the past year, we're going to take out that sentence, which was mentioned in the beginning here, and we're going to put in that we're referring to the vows in the coming year. Unidarim shel shana haba'ah hu desharinin. We're undoing the vows of the coming year. V'samach ledavar, and this is all based upon a Gemara. So let's just move away from Tosfot for a second, and I want to show you a Gemara. The next source. Let's learn a Gemara. Harotzeh shelo yitkaimu nidarav kol hashana. Somebody who doesn't want any of their vows to exist in the coming year, right? Coming year, Yamod b'Rosh Hashanah. He should stand up on Rosh Hashanah v'yomar, and he should make the following declaration: Kol neder shani atid lidor. Any vow that I'm about to make in the coming 12 months, Yehei batel. It's nullified. As long as he remembers when he makes the neder that he had made this proclamation at the beginning of the year. So let me just explain what this seems to be doing. I mean, it's a little bit of a strange Gemara because it's not nullifying vows the way we know about. It's not in the context of the family, Hafarat Nidarim. It's not in the context of going before a Beit Din, Hatarat Nidarim, with all the different requirements of that, which we've just enumerated. It's something else. What it seems to be is the following. Anybody here who has ever spoken to a pious Jew from Efrat knows that if you take an ordinary conversation and you sprinkle liberally into that conversation 3 phrases, Bezras Hashem, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, and Bli Neder. So you just randomly sprinkle those 3 phrases into any speech, you will then sound like a very pious Jew from Efrat. And that's good. Well, this phrase, Bli Neder, what is that? You're saying, look, I may sound like I'm making a commitment, but I just want you to understand I'm making a good faith effort. I'm not really making a formal commitment. It's not really a neder. That's why I'm saying Bli Neder. Bli Neder, without a vow. That phrase, without a vow. The Gemara seems to be suggesting that instead of sounding like a pious Jew from Efrat, that you have to liberally sprinkle in Im Yirtzeh Hashem, Bezras Hashem, and Bli Neder into every other word in whatever you say. Stand up at the beginning of the year and make a declaration. Say, I hereby declare anything I say in the next 12 months that may sound like a commitment, like a formal neder. I don't mean it. I just wasn't very careful with my words. I don't want to create any misimpressions. So I'm going to right now shoot out a Bli Neder, which will automatically attach to all of my commitments for the next 12 months to clarify my intent. And that way I don't have to sound like a pious Jew from Efrat who inserts the word Bli Neder into every other sentence.
But how does that work a year ahead of time? Does anyone take that seriously?
Why not? If you can make a vow that says you won't eat any Haagen-Dazs for the coming year, the entire year, why can't you say anything I say as a vow won't work for the coming year?
You're almost declaring yourself criminally insane in advance. You know, just saying any act that I will do from now onwards for the next year, whatever it is, doesn't matter what it is, please disregard it, because what I'm saying, don't listen to me, because I'm nuts.
Yeah. Okay. So if that's what is happening, then you're right. That would be nuts. But that's not what's happening. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. So let me try to clarify. What we're doing is we're saying, it's just like saying Bli Neder, but we're doing it in advance. However, what if in the next 6 months, 6 months later, I really do make a vow on purpose? I know that I made like a kind of like collective Bli Neder for everything I'll say in this coming year, only in the sense I want to clarify my intent, because I don't want people to think, or I don't even want it to be interpreted by heaven, that as if I'm making a vow. I just want to clarify my intent. But you should know, I am so moved by Torah institutions, or Torah institutions, that I am vowing to donate $1 million. By the way, this is Bli Neder. So, and this is Neder. And I want my name on the building too. Okay, so that's a neder. This won't help for something like that. That's a neder, right? So it's not like magical nullification of vows, right? And of regret. That's hatarat nedarim. That works only backwards. This is simply saying, if I say something that's ambiguous, I'm now defining what I meant. But if you were unambiguous, I really do mean this as a vow, this won't help, this declaration on Rosh Hashanah.
Oh, it doesn't say that.
Yes, so I'm explaining what I think the Gemara means. I know. I
know.
I know.
You give a very nice, rational explanation, except that's not what the Gemara says.
I feel your pain. So, if you can find a better explanation, I'll give you a big virtual hug. But
just a question about what Danny's
wait,
saying.
let me just finish. I just want to respond. Given the fact that we only know of two mechanisms to nullify vows, right? Either within the context of the family Hafrat Nadarim, or before a Beit Din, which is Hatarat Nadarim, then this Gemara is hard to understand. There's no mechanism that this adheres to. So that's why, and I don't think I'm making this up, I believe that's Meforshim explained this, that it's like saying Bali Neder. You're just clarifying ambiguous intent, but if a person didn't have ambiguous intent, that's really what they meant, this wouldn't help. The Seder? We'll leave it at that.
Sorry,
and Danny, if you could find a better explanation, I'd be delighted.
What's the end of the Gemara? The last few words of Uvad Sheyeh Zachur B'Shai?
Yeah, that's precisely my point. That's if, so you have to bear in mind, in other words, this only works if you're bearing in mind that you're essentially making a bli neder in advance, right? So that when your person says, I'll donate $1 million, right? So you have in the back of your mind, you're thinking, yeah, but it's okay. So I said it like that, but it wasn't a neder because I remember I said at the beginning of the year that don't misinterpret my commitments, right? They're not nidarim. Well, what if a person really did mean it at that time? They're not remembering anymore that they made this, in melechatchila, this sort of advanced clarification of their intent. They really do mean this as a vow. It's not going to help. Okay, now.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Could someone like Don Rickles, the comedian, the beginning of every year say, I'm going to be saying jokes all year long, insulting everyone left and right, but it's all just a joke. I don't want anyone to take it personally, and I'm not here to speak disparaging. It's just a joke. And then he goes on for the year insulting people.
That's sort of what this is. That's sort of.
And can people then say, hey, but I feel insulted nevertheless. Apologize to me.
So I mean, I thought you were just giving like an analogy. That won't work, right? You can't say I'm going to hurt people's feelings the entire year, but it won't count because I said in the beginning of the year that it's just a joke, right? That's not going to help. Okay, so now I want to go back into Rabbeinu Tam. So he says that the only way he can figure out that Kol Nidre could make any sense whatsoever is if we assume that that's really what's going on, as cited in this Gemara in Masechet Nidarim, that it's nothing to do with the year's past vows. You're standing up, like it says in the Gemara, in the beginning of the year, and you're simply saying, don't misinterpret anything that I say that sounds like a vow. It's a bli neder, it's not a vow. That's how Rabbeinu Tam explains what Kol Nidre is, but he had to amend the text. He had to delete the phrase of from last Yom Kippur to this Yom Kippur and substitute the phrase instead from this Kippur, Yom Kippur, till next Yom Kippur. Wow. Okay, fine. So then he goes on and he points out something. There's a problem because that Gemara said, when are you supposed to do this? It said on Rosh Hashanah, except that's not what we're doing. We're doing Yom Kippur. The truth of the matter is, Danny does not lose any sleep over this because Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, what's the difference, right? So, and it could be that there is no difference. But he actually has a very interesting explanation, and he says that Ashkechan, I just skipped a few words, Yom Kippur, the Ikre Rosh Hashanah. He says he actually found the source in Yechezkel, where Yom Kippur is called Rosh Hashanah. Because it says there, Rosh Hashanah Besur Lechodesh. On Rosh Hashanah, on the 10th of the month. That's a pasuk in Yechezkel. That's a weird pasuk. What's the 10th of the month? What holiday is that? It's Yom Kippur. When Yechezkel calls it Rosh Hashanah. So that's what he gets over it by saying, okay, it says Rosh Hashanah, but Rosh Hashanah is actually also a term for Yom Kippur. It's finding in Yechezkel. And he also says, but you know what? There might be a simpler explanation. That is that after all, Ba'ochu Samuch Rosh Hashanah. It's close to Rosh Hashanah. It's the beginning of the year, 10 days different. What's the difference, right? It's close enough. Okay. And he also had something there at the end. He says, why did the people who established this practice dafka put it on Yom Kippur? It could have been on Rosh Hashanah, right? That's the literal meaning of the Gemara. So
But it's actually done before Yom Kippur, right before. It's like a last chance. It's like a last chance type of deal.
Yeah. So you're saying like it's is your point that it's like in that way?
It's
Sort
done
of
before Ma'ariv.
So in that sense, it's like it could be sort of seen as like an extension of Rosh Hashanah, and it's not on Yom Kippur in any way. It's right before Yom Kippur.
Exactly.
Is that what you mean? Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. He also points out something interesting at the end. He says, we'll just read that. He says,
because it's not really a tefillah. It's not. We make no requests. We're not addressing it to Hashem. It's more like a declaration that you would do in front of a court, in essence.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a last minute. It's a last minute nullification.
Right. You know? That's true. Except it's not nullification, right? It's according to Rabbeinu Tam, it's a clarification in advance.
If you go with the original text,
because right now we're not going with the original text. We're going with Rabbeinu Tam. He also points out one last thing, which I won't read it. He just says there are more people in shul ever called Nidre, okay, which is I'm sure is true. Okay. Well, wow. So now we have this kind of like we know why some of the sages in Bavel didn't like Kol Nidre because it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't really nullify any vows from the past. And we know why that is, based upon Rabbeinu Tam's detailing of the problems. And we know how he saved it by making a pretty severe textual limitation referring to vows in the coming year and saying it's not really Hatarat Nidarim, but it's rather a clarification of ambiguous statements which may occur in the following year. Fine. The Rosh. The Rosh, who lived a couple generations after Rabbeinu Tam, so one of the greatest commentators and codifiers of Talmudic law, he says, with all due respect to Rabbeinu Tam's wrong. Kol Nidre, and this will make Arthur feel much better, in its original formulation, does in fact fulfill every requirement of Hatarat Nidarim, and it is canceling the vows from the past year as the original text stated. How so? Let's read it. Umashi ikshad debainin charata, and that which Rabbeinu Tam asked the question that you need to say, I regret making this vow. If I would have known in advance back then what I do know now, I would have never made it. Nonsense. You don't need that in the case of Kol Nidre. Why? Anansade shekol mishavar nidro hu mitkaret meikaro tedei linatzel meonish. Because anansade is the Aramaic expression, which means literally we are witnesses, or we can testify. That expression is used when something is so obvious that it doesn't need to be stated. It's a halachic principle. It can substitute for someone explicitly saying something because it's obviously true. If somebody is coming to Kol Nidre in terrible emotional distress, worrying about vows they may have made, and they're hoping that Kol Nidre is going to get rid of them, obviously they regret having made those vows. Or else, what are they doing there? Now, you could say because it said printed on the shul announcements that davening Yom Kippur starts at 6:30, so they showed up at 6:30 and it's called Nidre, or they like the melody, or something like that.
No joke. But many people don't know what they're saying.
As a matter of fact, I'm sure most people don't know. But the Rosh's point is that he's assuming that like people are coming to Kol Nidre for what they think is the effect of Kol Nidre, which is to nullify the vows from the past year, and therefore, obviously, they're motivated by regret. So it doesn't need to be stated. That's number one. Then he goes on. And that which Rabbeinu Tam, in his halachic purity, I'm adding that in, said that you need to have a beit din to do this. No problem. He says that the custom is everybody says it. I don't know if you've seen this. People do it. So you might have thought it's just because they like the melody, so they sing along with the Chazan. According to the Rosh, no, it's for a halachic reason. You know why? Because the entire congregation is the beit din. Not only do you have 3 judges, you got 350 judges. You can have more than 3, right? So that's the Beit Din. We do have a Beit Din. It's the shul. It's the congregation, right?
Doesn't work.
So it doesn't like it.
Wouldn't they need Kavanah to know that? I mean,
okay, very good point. How many people in shul have in mind that they're constituting a Beit Din, nullifying their neighbor's vows?
And if they're the Beit Din, then they should be shutting up and listening, and then they should be saying it themselves, whoever's on the Beit Din, like we do in Hatarat Nedarim.
Yeah, so beautiful. So that's a beautiful point. So actually, Rabbeinu Tam actually mentioned that. I didn't mention it. He says, like, you can't wear 2 hats. Right? So the person who's nullifying the vow of a vower can't also be the beneficiary of the nullification, right? So it's a very good point.
But we do that in the morning.
Roche doesn't address that. I don't know what the answer is.
In the morning we do that. We just simply switch places. We play both roles.
So indeed, now you'll know why there's a custom in the morning of Rosh Hashanah to do a real Hatarat Nedarim. And that's where you really have 3 Dayanim, right? 3 Jews, they sit there, and then one person goes before them, and then you trade, right? That person who already made his vows were nullified, he comes and sits on the Beit Din, and right? That's the way you do it. Okay.
Well, even then, even on that ceremony, according to Rabbeinu Tam strictly, if you have to detail all of your sins, you're doing that during Hatarat Nedarim.
Yeah, very good question. That's the Rosh's next point.
In the Rinat Yisrael Machzor, they actually go from last year to this year, from this year to next year.
Okay, we'll discuss that in a second. Hang on a second. Right, you're one step ahead of me. So just this issue that Danny raised, that what about the explicit detailing of the vow? So the Rosh answers that in his last point here, and he says that requirement is actually not an absolute requirement. It's only under very specific and not relevant purposes. Without going into detail, he says, I disagree with Rabbeinu Tam that it's an absolute requirement. It's actually a debate in the Talmud between Amoraim whether that's a requirement. And so the Rosh says that if you look at the Talmudic discussion carefully, it's not an absolute requirement. It's only under very special circumstances. No circumstances are not valid. So that's how he gets rid of that requirement.
Rabbi Zef, the implication according to the Rosh is that women can sit on the Beit Din.
So, why? Because they're part of the congregation?
Yeah, they're in shul.
Well, I don't know if you're serious or not, but
I'm not sure.
Yeah, okay, you're not serious. Good, we'll leave it at that. Okay.
Try to get you into trouble here.
You're a tricky guy. I'm a married man. You got to be careful here. So okay, so fine. That's the Rosh. The Rosh defends the original custom. So now we get to Arthur's point. What's really fascinating now is, don't do it right now, whip out your Machzor and take a look at what it says. And in fact, you will find every possibility. Some Machzorim are in accordance with the original custom. It's nullification of last year's vows. How could you do that? It's nonsense. It's not nonsense. The Rosh explained how it's not nonsense. Some of them are like Rabbeinu Tam. They only mention the next year's vows. And so that's in accordance with Rabbeinu Tam's valiant attempt at resurrecting Kol Nidre by saying it's not really nullification, it's clarification of future vows. And I believe the Art Scroll, and I think Rinat Yisrael, whoever, Arthur, you mentioned it, there are some
Rinat
others,
Yisrael.
Rinat Yisrael, that they put in both. That's a good Jewish custom. So we're going to put in last year's vows. That's in accordance with the original custom, as explained by the Rosh. We're going to put in next year's vows. That's in accordance with Rabbeinu Tam's considerations, right? And clarification. And that way, Shalom Yisrael, we did everything. Okay. So
Wouldn't you say if we cancel them in the morning that this is just a perfunctory statement of no great relevance if everyone has already canceled them?
Yeah. So now Bruce is making a good point. We have a custom to do a real Hatarat Nedarim in the morning. So wait a second. So if that's true, according to the original version of Kol Nidre that were nullifying formally the vows of the past year, I just did it already in the morning. Yeah. Doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. But you know what it could be, actually? I'm just thinking, I'm just speculation right now. Since there's really good reasons to think it doesn't make any sense, right? Like Rabbeinu Tom's complaints and the fact that it was thrown out by Rav Amram Gaon and it's forbidden to say, so we're kind of hedging our bets. Jews do this too. Like, you know how they, like when you build a space, these rocket ships, there's redundancy of systems. Like if this system breaks, we got another system to take over. This is like halachic redundancy. We do this, by the way, in like when we get rid of chametz, we have all kinds of different things we do, bitul, and we also look for it, right? So we have like these halachic redundancy. Or like also with chametz, when we sell it. Every type of kinyan, every type of way of transferring ownership is done when they sell chametz to a non-Jew. Like,
isn't it just easy to say that we do a lot of stuff in shul, in public, for the tzibur, for the congregation, because we can't be sure that everyone knows how to do it privately? And there are plenty of examples where we make kiddush on Friday night in all the congregations in Chutz La'aretz.
Okay, that's nice. So your point, if I understand you properly, you're saying not everybody went to shul in the morning and did Hatarat Nedarim, or maybe they didn't even know what it meant. They just like mumbled something. They just followed what everybody else was doing.
Absolutely.
So this covers for them. That could be.
That's what happens in the morning.
Yeah, that could be.
I mean, the women for sure, you know.
Yeah, it could be. So now what I want to do.
You didn't answer why Saadia Gaon would permit it to be done in Hebrew in an Aramaic-speaking community.
Oh, yeah. So Rav Amram, by the way. So not Rav Saadia. So that's not really a halachic issue, right? It's just like, it's just interesting to note.
Well, it shouldn't work. I mean, no one knows what they're saying.
No, why? No, I mean, the Hebrew words and the Aramaic words in this particular case are almost identical. Like, it's like, you know, that shouldn't be.
By the way, I should mention at this point, for Bruce's benefit, and maybe a rabbi knows this, maybe you don't, I was in shul in Rome during the week a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
In the old shul in the ghetto, and was looking for siddur in the stand in front of me, and found a matzah from Yom Kippur, which is probably the last time the guy was in shul, the guy's place I was sitting in. And opened the matzah as I was davening, just because it was interesting to see. You know, they have their own nusach in Italy.
Right.
And the Kol Nidre nusach is exactly this one. It's all in Hebrew. It's the first time I've seen that.
Interesting. Yeah. So in accordance with Amram Gaon from the oldest Hebrew, that is interesting. Okay, now I want to spend the next 7 minutes that we have left going forward in history and showing you something really fascinating. Kol Nidre was very halachically problematic, as we just pointed out. It's very hard to know what it is, and we saw the debates back and forth. It was also very problematic in Christian-Jewish relationships. Why? So I'm going to do this in a little bit different order. I'm going to look at the, if you're looking along with me, at the bottom of page 5, where it says, Vikuach Rabbeinu Yechiel mi Paris, Imamumar Nikulan Doni. Start with that, then we'll go to the source above it. Unfortunately, as you may have seen already, and till this very day, you know who the worst enemies of the Jews are? Jews. Okay? Nobody, of course, in the front kollel. Right? So, case in point. The year 1240, a Jew, who I don't know what his original name was, it was probably Seymour Epstein. So he converted to Catholicism, and he takes on the name Nicholas Donin. That's his name now. And he goes before the Pope. I am not joking. Sounds like the beginning of a bad joke, but it wasn't funny. And he says, these Jews are despicable people. They can't be trusted. They're horrible. And one of the main reasons is they have this book called the Talmud, and that Talmud is full of horrible things, including the fact, you can never trust them because as soon as they make a commitment, they nullify it. The Pope says, oh, interesting. Nicholas Donin goes back to France, where he lived, discusses this with very high-ranking church officials. It's decided to make a debate about the Talmud between him, this former Jew, and halakhically, by the way, of course, he's still Jewish. You can't erase your being Jewish. You can be a very bad Jew, but even if you're the Pope, you're still Jewish, right? So a debate between him and one of the leading Balei Tosfot, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris. And they have a whole debate. And it's about the Talmud. And we have what's supposed to be a transcript. Now, that transcript was written by a Jew. Some people say Rabbi Yechiel of Paris himself wrote it. Some people say it was probably a Talmud of Rabbi Yechiel. But you can imagine that that particular transcript makes the rabbi look pretty good and makes Nicholas Donin look pretty evil. The fact that Nicholas Donin is pretty evil, I'm sure that's true. Whether Nicholas Donin was so superior in debating skills to this Nicholas Donin, I don't know, but that's the version we have. So Nicholas Donin, since we don't have too much time, I'll sort of just paraphrase this. Nicholas Donin gets up there in the debate and he says, these Jews are despicable. You can't trust anything they say because they have all these Talmudic mechanisms of getting rid of vows. And he quotes them all. He quotes the Gemara Masechet Rosh Hashanah, says you can stand at the beginning of the year and nullify your vows in advance. He cites explicitly Kol Nidre. And he says that therefore they will never live up to their commitment, or they certainly never feel committed to a commitment when they do a deal with a non-Jew. Okay? So the rabbi gets up and says, you obviously did not spend enough time studying in the Efrat Kollel because you don't clearly understand what these things are. And Rabbi Yechiel Paris explains that, in fact, with regards to Kol Nidre go back to the Rambam. That's only if you're forbidding something to yourself which is normally permitted, like I'm not, Haagen-Dazs ice cream is forbidden to me, or I'm designating this animal as a gift to the Holy Temple. But Kol Nidre or Hatarat Nidarim has no impact on a commitment between two people whatsoever. So that was how the rabbi dealt with that. Unfortunately, I guess it wasn't very convincing, or it didn't matter whether it's convincing or not because the conclusion was foregone. 1242, Paris, the church rounds up every available edition of the Talmud and they're burnt. On Tisha B'Av, we have piyutim, kinot, that talk about this great tragedy. Interesting to note, a little speculation on my part, France was a great center of Talmudic scholarship. But after 1242, it goes down. And scholarship moves to Germany, Poland, etc. It moves eastward. What happened to France? No books, no learning.
It was actually this whole dispute. He listed 35 different quotes from the Talmud. Before this, Christianity just thought of the Jews as following the Old Testament, honoring the laws of God and Moses and the prophets. But when what they quoted were blasphemies against which Christians interpreted the way he wrote it, that it was against Jesus and Mary and it was all blasphemous in terms of the Christian theology. So it changed the perception of what the Jews were.
Yeah, okay. And so this was really damaging. And Kol Nidre played an important component in the Lashon Hora, how he was portraying the Talmud in a very bad light and Jews in a very bad light. Now, the next thing I want to share with you, and we'll have to do this fast, is there was instituted, interestingly enough, as early as the 10th century, up until 1902, we have evidence that this existed, an oath that Jews were required to take. It's called in Latin, More Judaico. And it's a special oath which Jews had to take because since we can't trust them because they have Kol Nidre, so they were forced to make some kind of pledge, which would kind of nullify the nullification, like, so that they would be forced into abiding by their words because you can't trust them because of Kol Nidre. And I actually have a whole text here where it's very dramatic, and so it was done in different ways in different countries, but among them was that they made the Jew stand in a barrel of water, and they made him put a wreath of thorns on his head, which apparently was like to be evocative of Jesus. And they made him do this whole recitation of if he breaks any kind of promises, that all possible curses will devolve upon him, will be struck down by lightning. I'm not making that up. That's actually explicitly mentioned. Will be struck down by lightning. First it says, I should be struck down by lightning, and all my children should, something terrible should happen to them, and we'll all starve, and blah, 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 blah. And this was an attempt to nullify what was presumed to be the lack of trustworthiness of Jews because of Kol Nidre. Now, just one more half a minute. What happens when you get into more modern times? So the Reform, Abraham Geiger was one of the pioneers of the Reform movement. He totally did away with Kol Nidre, but people liked it. So he rewrote a Kol Nidre, which has nothing to do with vows. I actually have the text here on the paper where he just talks about, he uses poetry that sounds like Kol Nidre, but it's not. It's like, God, please wipe away our sins. But he used this language which is evocative of Kol Nidre, so you could like sing it. Sounds like Kol Nidre, but it has nothing to do with anything to do with vows. And interestingly enough, for maybe Abraham Geiger, it's not so surprising, but Hirsch, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, in the 19th century, he attempted, when he was rabbi of a certain community there, to get rid of Kol Nidre, and he did 1 year. He canceled Kol Nidre. But people were so upset, people loved Kol Nidre, that he was forced the next year to reinstitute it. But he did that. I'm sorry, yeah, Shimshon Raphael Hirsch.
Wow.
Yeah.
Our next speaker says he's running just a few minutes late.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. So I can slow down just a bit. So now, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch had very good grounds. Because after all, if you look at the history, Kol Nidre is very problematic. It's even forbidden to do it, according to Rav Amram Gaon. So, like, getting rid of it, considering all the anti-Semitism that it aids and abets, why not just get rid of it? So, but people are very attached to it emotionally. So I just want to very quickly, why are people so emotionally attached to Kol Nidre? And the answer is, I don't really know. But I'm going to throw out a couple suggestions. Number one, great melody. And I don't know how old the melody we use is, but it is a very haunting and beautiful melody. Number one. Number two, at least until modern times, Jews really did take vows very seriously, and they're very scared. You remember what it said in Kohelet? God's going to destroy the work of your hands, that even if you fulfill the vow, you're called evil, that we saw that in the Talmud.
But that's a vow in God's name. It's not the typical vow people just say, I'll see you tomorrow. We call that a vow, but not really.
No, not all types of vows require God's name. You should know. So it could be that like people really did feel weighed down by anything that may have been a vow, and it was a big relief to go to Kol Nidre. There may be another reason, and this may be sermonic, and that is that if you take a look at the all hates that you do in Yom Kippur, I actually didn't do the math, but I'm pretty sure if you do the math, you'll find that a majority of them have to do with the improper use of language. Really interesting. And you don't need the all hates for that, by the way. Just think about your own life. Think about my own life, right? When do we get into trouble? I have not robbed a bank lately or murdered anybody yet, right? But I do hurt people's feelings, right? Like, that's what happens, right? That's when we get messed up. For most of us. We're not criminals, most of us, right? So the centrality of the improper use of words is very central to Yom Kippur. Not only that, but I'm sure that an idea you've heard a million times. When the Torah says that God made the first human being and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, Vayidam nefesh chaya, and man became a living being, nefesh chaya, the Aramaic translation translates that ruach mimalala, a speaking being, implying that the power of speech is that which makes us human. It's that which is singular to us. And that sense is sort of like our most sacred characteristic and tool. So therefore, the abuse of that, or the improper use of it, is a kind of betrayal of our very humanity, that which makes us human. And therefore, to enter into Yom Kippur, we sort of do a kind of inventory on our lives. Have we lived up to the expectations that God has of us and we have of us? To think about the proper and improper use of speech is a very good tone to begin Yom Kippur with.
Wouldn't you say that discernment is a higher level? I mean, many animals communicate, but we're the ones who can discern between things. And when people are joking or not joking, the fact that people take things a little too seriously is more of a problem than what people even say. I mean, what happened to sticks and stones? Why don't we apply that and give benefit of the doubt?
Yeah. So what you see here is that maybe your assumption is incorrect. I was also taught sticks and stones may break my bones, words will never hurt me. But that is not said by the sages of the Talmud. On the contrary, we actually say that words are very significant, right? Talk is cheap. No, talk is expensive, right? So just a little cognitive distortion there. Change your assumption. Okay, so on that note, I want to wish you, as all your teachers are wishing you, the Gemar Chatima Tova, everybody should be inscribed, and we should have a year of very careful use of our capacity for speech.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.